Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and I thought long and hard about what I wanted to talk about tonight. But the things that I thought about, which are to do with spirituality more strictly, seemed vain, considering what has been going on in the world in the past couple of days. There have been some events in the US that have been absolutely sickening and have caused quite a visceral reaction in a lot of people. And I think some people have said that this is the beginning of a new chapter, a kind of a turning point, if you will, in politics. And I'm getting a similar feeling. And I think it's impossible to not comment on it. And I think that there is some dangerous groups that are going to benefit from these events or feel emboldened by them, which it's important to talk about and talk about the danger that they pose. And so this is a spiritual channel, so I'm going to try and bring spirituality into it and particularly talk about how we got to this point because we have lost touch with that part of ourselves, and that expresses itself in the form of certain ideologies. And I also wanted to talk about it because I don't want to be one of those spiritual people who just ignores the problems of the world, who acts like he's far above it because he's just meditating all the time and blissed out all the time and just so enlightened that he's detached from it all. I think it's important to pay attention to what's going on in the world. And I think it's important to call out injustice. And I think as I present myself as a spiritual figure, there is a certain obligation on me to take a stand against injustice. If I see something which goes against my moral principles and which I see as an imminent danger to society. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I've tried to avoid talking about politics because I just think that it gets into some really awful, divisive territory, but I don't feel I can ignore it anymore. I feel there's an urgency now to talk about it. There's a couple of groups in society that I'm very worried about. One of them is a present danger, and the other one is a future danger who will feed upon and take advantage of the chaos created by the present danger. And I want to talk more about that. Although this is something that's happened in the US, it has had cultural reverberations throughout the Western world, including here in Australia. And what I'm talking about, of course, is two events. The horrific stabbing of Iryna Zarutska in Charlotte, and then the next day, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It feels like with the passing of these two individuals, the last hope of civil debate and discourse drew its last breath as well. Hopefully that's wrong, but it certainly feels right now that the US is entering dangerous territory. A lot of psychic people on Instagram were saying that they felt a heaviness coming down upon them for the year to come, kind of at the beginning of this year, end of last year. And I think this is really the beginning of what they were starting to feel then. Unfortunately, in terms of what I foresee for the US in the future, I don't have a lot of good news. And I wish that I could be a false prophet so that my predictions didn't come true. But it's not looking good, guys, honestly. Australia, it's got its problems as well, but they pale in comparison to what's going on over there in the US and in Europe. So when the curtain falls over there, come here and seek political asylum if you want. But yeah, not looking good at all. Something has gone fundamentally wrong in Western society, but particularly US society, and it may be too late to fix it now. I want to talk about what I think that went so wrong, at least from one angle of it, related to the events of the past couple of days. One thing that I would like to be able to do is provide some words of encouragement towards returning to a more balanced worldview for people living in the US, rather than these political camps that have these unbridgeable gulfs between them and irreconcilable differences. Although I think the ship may have sailed on that, unfortunately. And America seems to be a society where, as William Butler Yeats said in his poem, The Second Coming, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. But all I can do is try, really. So I'm going to denounce certain groups of people in this video. And in order for me to not be misconstrued for the reasons why I'm doing that, and associated with some very negative people in history, I'm going to go through the entire evolution of my political beliefs to how I reached the point that I'm at now in terms of my attitudes towards certain movements. So, and I haven't spoken about my politics before, but now I think I need to put my cards on the table because we need to start having these discussions. So basically, many years ago, probably close to 20 years ago now, I formed my political identity as a teenager, and I decided that I was left-wing. So for me at the time, the reason why I was attracted to the left, and in fact the far left for that matter, was because I was against pointless imperialistic wars. I was against economic exploitation and obscene wealth inequality, and I was against discriminating against people based on their skin color, judging an entire group of people because of their skin color, or not caring about a group of people just because of their skin color or their gender for that matter. I was against intolerance towards people with different opinions. And I was an environmentalist. I cared about the planet and making sure that we leave behind a livable planet for future generations. I cared deeply about ordinary people, the little person who was disadvantaged by an unfair system. And I was against the misuse of political power. And I was against authoritarianism, very much against people who felt it was their right to tell other people what to think, what they could and could not say, and so on. So that was the thing that informed my worldview. And at the time, it was in the grips of the global war on terror. And the people that were the authoritarians were the conservative Christians who were, saying, if you're not with us, you're against us, and all of this sort of stuff. Introducing anti-terror legislation, all this kind of stuff that was pushing us away from that society that I wanted. So I aligned myself with the far left as a way of challenging those power structures. But as time went on, I noticed that I was treated differently in the far left because I'm white, because I'm a male, and because I'm of the hetero persuasion. All of these things were bases on which to discriminate against me. And very funny for a movement that's against discrimination, apparently. And then I also began to notice that the kinds of people who were leading the radical left were really quite psychopathic individuals who had no regard for human life at all. And if there were a successful revolution, it would be monstrous to have such people in power. Completely inhuman in their outlook. And it began to dawn on me just how nefarious the radical left really is. And eventually I quit, but I still considered myself on the left side of politics. But around this time, identity politics was starting to creep into left-wing politics. It was less about sticking up for the ordinary person against the government and the corporations, and more about, I identify as this and I identify as that, and you're privileged and you're oppressed, dividing people into these identities and pitting them against one another, which was anathema to what I believed, what I thought it meant to be left-wing, which is that, everybody needs to join together, that all of the divisions that are sown between us based on race and gender and things like that are things that the ruling class has put in place to divide us, so we won't unite against the people that are really exploiting us. But now all of a sudden, class disappeared from leftism altogether, went out the door, and it was all about identity. One identity versus another. And not only that, but it became increasingly hostile. What I saw the left morphing into was a movement of hate and intolerance, which justified cruelty against entire groups of people just because they were perceived as privileged, or, God forbid, because they had a different political view to somebody else. This is what is commonly referred to today as wokeism. And, I have been concerned about it for a long time, as you can imagine, because I'm its main target. I mean, just look at me. And this was the reason why. The fact that the left became so woke was the reason why I eventually left the left and decided I wanted nothing at all to do with this political movement. But I refrained from speaking out against it because that would align me with people that I also disagreed with politically, on the other side of the aisle. And when it was just cancel culture, just a war that was waged upon me through soft power, through cultural institutions, I felt like my voice wasn't needed to combat against this, that the tide would turn, and that it was something that would eventually be easy to roll back when society could return to a more sane position. And for a while this year, it looked like the left was entering a post-woke era, which was a really welcome sign to me, and I was hopeful. But now I can see that the left has learned nothing, and if anything, it has become more entrenched in its hatred and intolerance to those that it disagrees with, or those who it deems to be the enemy. And so now we have arrived at today's point. You've got one example of a shooter who, while we don't know who it is and what their motivations are, we have seen the outpouring of glee from members of the radical left online about a person's life being taken, a person who had a family, had 2 young children and a wife, who now are grieving, 2 children who will grow up without a father, which the left might not think is important, but it is. And to react that way to a life being taken, forget about his political views. They were more conservative, and they might have, irritated some people, but did he deserve to lose his life because of that? No, of course not. And the only people who need to silence those that disagree with them and want to debate with them like that are authoritarians and dictators. And the only people that celebrate such measures being used are authoritarians, people who have a worldview that is incompatible with Western democracy. As for the other incident, the incident on the light rail, although it was related more to mental illness, there were a series of public policy positions which led to that being able to happen. A judge who was appointed to the position for political reasons more than anything, it seems, let someone go based on an ideological bias who never should have been released back into the community. And one thing led to another. The crime itself could have had a racial component. The indifference of the other people on that carriage could very well have had a racial component as well. And so these are all manifestations of the same rot, which can be traced back to the radical left and the influence that they have been able to have on our culture over the past 10 years. And now people are losing their lives because of it. Maybe they were already in more subtle ways, but now it's really getting serious. Look, there's baddies on both extremes of the political spectrum, but that's not what we're talking about today. It's the left that has disgraced themselves these last couple of days. And it's finally pushed me to a point where I feel they're dangerous enough that I need to speak out against them. After having tried so hard for so many years to cling on to that philosophy of life, I just find the whole movement unsupportable now. And I'm definitely not left-wing anymore. That there's just no way that I can associate. How can I associate myself with a movement that hates me just because of the color of my skin? How can I support a movement like that? It's impossible. But by the same token, I'm not right-wing. I mean, my social positions on issues now, having revisited them from multiple angles and really thought about them, I'd probably be considered like a boring old moderate, or at least a moderate by the standards of 20 years ago. The Overton window has moved in such an insane direction, I'd probably be considered right-wing on social issues now, even though I'm not. So there's that. it might be disappointing to some people to learn that my views are like the average suburban dad standing in front of a grill on a lot of social issues. In terms of economics, I'm probably still very left-wing because I understand there is economic injustice in the world and that the power that the elite holds over us is fundamentally economic in nature and has to do with their membership of the same class. That's one conclusion that I drew in my youth, which I continue to hold to this day. But my views have changed and evolved, but I'm certainly not right-wing. I'm not like MAGA or anything. I'm not alt-right, even though I've been accused of it, because I don't agree with everything that the dogmatic extreme left says. But I have been, reconsidering questions of political philosophy, and I've been thinking more about the origins of the left and thinking about it from a spiritual angle in trying to understand how we got to this point. How did we get here with these people with such vitriol and such irrational vitriol towards other people that they don't even see the value in the life of another human being just for being a bit different to them. And I think it comes down to morality. It comes down to the fact that the leftist exists in a completely different moral universe to the one that the majority of people in a Judeo-Christian society have taken for granted for the longest time. And I say this as somebody who has studied left-wing politics in a lot of depth, because that used to be the world that I lived in. I would live and breathe it. So I understand it from the inside. And when thinking about morality and the left, one important book to consider is Their Morality and Ours by Leon Trotsky, where Trotsky talks about how Christian morality is a bourgeois invention, but has no objective reality, and that in fact, morality is relative depending on what your class position is. And for Trotsky, this kind of idealization of moral virtues was something that was against materialism, because the left was radically materialistic. The Marxist left didn't believe in God, didn't believe in religion, wanted to make everything scientific, and wanted to put man in place of God. So they rejected any idea of objective morality, said that it was just the ideology of a particular society, and therefore what was moral was merely what was in the interests of a particular group of people seeking political power. I mean, it was framed in terms of classes, but Marxism, communism, it's not really about the proletariat. It's about a group of intellectuals who think they're better than everybody else, using the working class to seize power and then set themselves up as the absolute rulers of everybody else, down to the very thoughts that they think. And so morality was anything at all that would help that group come to power. Or as Trotsky framed it, the ends justify the means so long as the end is justified. And of course, the end in this case is the victory of the party. Of course, Trotsky phrased it as the victory of the proletariat, but in practice, it's the victory of the absolutist communist party. In the leftist worldview, because let's face it, the modern left is mostly influenced by Marxism and communism, not by Western liberalism. In the leftist worldview, there is no good and evil. There is simply power. And power and the pursuit of power of one group at the expense of another justifies everything, up to and including taking human life, up to and including excluding groups that are labeled as privileged and discriminating against them. That is the leftist mindset. And those are the values that our society has decided to adopt in the last 10 years, at least the cultural institutions. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. And I think that really is at the core of the problem here. The decline in general morality is an outcome of modernity anyway, because it just alienates us from our old traditions, from one another, and so forth. But really, what this leftism is, and it used to be communism, now it's much more under the guise of postmodernism, postmodern identity politics, and critical theory and things like that. its objective really is to destroy morality and replace it with just a bunch of competing individual narratives about relative truth. And so it's really about destroying God and destroying God's place in the fabric of society and having God at the center, which really is destroying the foundation of Western civilization, from the revelation at Mount Sinai through to the conversion of the Roman Empire, through to the establishment of Christendom, through to up until very recently, modern times. And that has consequences. And I think they're wholly negative, because what I've come to realize during my spiritual practices and my spiritual insights is that you can't actually understand morality without spirituality. The left has tried, the atheist left, and there are some right-wing atheists as well, but it's mainly the left that intersects with atheism. They've tried to say that you can create morality using pure logic, using pure reason. It's just not true. You can create a logical argument for anything. You can come up with abstract ideas that justify just about anything. Once you've disconnected thought from reality, you can justify anything. And the mind does do that. It does that in terms of our shortcomings and why we're not to blame for doing something that hurt another person. We do this all the time. Logic is not inherently moral. It does not necessarily lead us to the most moral conclusion. Where morality really comes from, it'll sound cheesy, but it's here. It's from the heart. When we see something that is an injustice, like we see a picture of a war-torn country on the TV screen, we don't think, well, that is a very inefficient way of doing things. The loss of human life is wasteful. They could be an economic resource. Why don't they just trade instead of invading? This is most illogical, blah, blah, and come to a moral conclusion that way. No, we have a reaction in our gut and in our heart, and we just know that that is wrong. What's happening to those people, that it's immoral. We make a value judgment, and it's got nothing to do with rationality. It's the conscience. It's something completely different, and that is the part of us that connects us to God. You can think of God as like the glue that holds everything together, the intrinsic unity of all things and harmonious order that all things exist in. The manifest aspect of God is really that. And the heart tells us whether or not we are resonating with that order and that harmony. And so it becomes like the barometer for our connection with God and whether or not we are following the will of God. And that really is where morality comes from. That is where our moral sense comes from. And then coming up with ethical systems is just a way of fleshing out the details of that later on. But the moral impulse comes from something other than rationality. And so if you take spirituality, or if you like religion and God, out of the equation of not only how do we live a moral life, but also how do we have a good society? What is the justification for our laws? Why should we follow them at all? But when you take God out of that, you end up with really monstrous political regimes. And political power is given permission to do just about anything it likes to people that disagree with it. And that's what we're seeing with the direction that the radical left has gone in. They've become increasingly atheistic as more moderate liberalism has kind of faded away. And they've become increasingly satanic, actually. There were some Etsy witches who cursed Charlie Kirk. So that's an interesting intersection as well that we could talk about more. But this is a dangerous political movement. It's dangerous for all the same reasons that the far right is dangerous. They're really just mirror images of each other at this point. And, the right idolizes power as well, but at least they pretend to care about God, even though the true God that they worship is power and money. Just the fact that just the superficial acknowledgement that that's important pulls us back a little bit from the abyss. So there's that. But the radical left and the radical right are both an imminent threat. The left more imminent than the right at this point. But So what would we be doing instead of that? What does a better kind of society look at compared to the one that's on offer from either of those political movements? And it's really Western democracy, Western liberal democracy. I think that Western civilization is something we've taken for granted since the end of the Cold War. We become so used to it that we just think that it's not important almost, and it's become so ubiquitous that it seems like there's nothing to lose in being as critical about it as we possibly can. And Western civilization kind of sabotages itself, it opens itself up to sabotage in a way that other societies don't, because it is so self-critical, because Christianity is all about repentance, and that is the cultural religious heritage that we've come from. There's a lot of self-criticism there. But of course, if you've got other people with different worldviews in the same space as you that see that as a weakness to take advantage of, it leaves you open to attack. So that's the catch-22. But all of the things that left-wing people or progressives claim to care about, human rights, democracy, respecting the autonomy of the individual to make choices about themselves, the right of women to not be harassed and objectified, and live in a society that looks down on those kinds of activities, having respect for human life and being merciful rather than punitive. All of that comes from the Western tradition. And we've kind of lost sight of that as well, because we take for granted that these are universal values. And that has been the hubris of the West, to say that Western values are universal and to presume that there is some natural order that means that other cultures are going to respect the same moral laws that we do because we've discovered the universal morality. But it's just not the case. Other cultures do not share the same values as the West. The human rights regime internationally has been criticized in the past by some really autocratic nations because it's a Western idea. And now that it's become much harder to challenge the status quo of a human rights-based international order, those same despotisms are now weaponizing the language of human rights against the West in a really insincere way, because they don't actually believe in human rights. And their countries are the worst human rights abusers. So it's really quite cynical. So what I'm trying to say is all of these things that we think are amazing things that are taking us towards this global utopia where everybody gets along with each other are Western ideas. They are Western ideas that could not have come about but for Christianity and to some extent Judaism. And the future vision of the world of that Western optimistic mindset is the vision of the prophets. That's why Isaiah is quoted on the side of the UN building. And so we need to be proud of that. And you're not allowed to say that anymore. You're not allowed to be proud of the fact that you live in a Western country. And there's a lot of benefits to the Western model of civilization for anybody who wants to join that kind of society sincerely and not just to screw with it from the inside. And so we need to take ownership of that again, and we need to realize that these ideals of democracy and human rights, they're not things that we can take for granted. They need to be defended and protected. And if a society becomes too open to difference, it loses that. It loses its identity, and it opens itself up to forces that want to undermine that and hijack the society and replace it with something far worse. That's what Karl Popper understood in his paradox of tolerance. And this is something that the left uses as well to justify their own authoritarianism towards people that think differently to them. And we often think about it in terms of Nazis and why we need to ruthlessly root out any form of the far right from our society, because it's so dangerous to those liberal values, I would say Western values. But it applies equally to other groups, because the far right is one group, but there are other groups that want to destroy this present Western society. The far left is undoubtedly one of them. Radical Islamism is another. Not Islam, Islamism, which is a political ideology within the Islamic world that doesn't reflect all of Islam. At the UCLA protests in the last couple of years, there were people holding up signs at those protests calling for the destruction of the West. That means the destruction of democracy. It means the destruction of a rights-based order. It means the destruction of the rule of law. That's what you're calling for when you call for the destruction of the West. And they will, if they can, and what they replace it with will be far worse than anything you complain about under the society that you currently live in. And so not only do we need to recognize that fact and begin to defend the traditions of the past before they fade into oblivion, we need to be strong in opposing the forces within that want to undermine that. And the last couple of days have proven that the left, the radical left, is one of those forces, and that it's not just silly people making silly TikToks about how they want to, end the life of all men or end the lives of all white people. They're serious when they say things like that. I don't think the government should have any more power than it already does, but the existing laws around inciting political violence and hate speech would be more than sufficient to at least put some of these woke TikTokers on a watch list, and in some cases probably even arrest them, because they are inciting political violence. And hell, people have been arrested in the UK for doing far less onerous things than that on social media. So I think we need to start taking this threat seriously, because it opens the doorway to far worse threats down the line. And I'm only going to talk about one of those tonight, and that is the far right. See, this hysterical carrying on by the far left about how Trump is a fascist and he's the same as, Mustachio Man, that there's somehow a moral equivalence there. It has completely destroyed the meaning of that word, of that political ideology. Behaving like that is actually pushing people that would have been moderate right towards the extreme right. And the thought process of somebody who's just a normal run-of-the-mill conservative might go something like this: I really despise what these people are doing to my society, and I want to stop them. And they're going to call me the F word no matter what I do, so what the hell? I might as well throw caution into the wind and just go as hard against them as I can, because they're going to call me that anyway. And that's dangerous. And if you physically eliminate the people like Charlie Kirk, who are the moderate right, it means that the person who's waiting in the wings is more extreme. Trump is not the tyrant that you should be afraid of. Trump is just a right-wing populist. He's a larrikin. He's a wild card. He veers right, and he can be quite obnoxious. But let's be honest, all of the things that he has done, which people have criticized, are things that Democrat presidents do as well. He's not what he's been made out to be, this evil dictator. But there are people in the US who do want that. There is a faction, you might say, within the Republicans who are commonly referred to as Dominionists. These are the people that want a Christian theocracy. And they've been biding their time, building up power behind the scenes and building up influence. And to think that they're never going to use that and make a grab for power is just naive. And the fact that the left has pushed so many people away and caused so much anger from so many people means that it's just fodder for these theocrats, these far-right theocrats, to rise to power. It's really concerning, actually. They're just as much at odds with the Western liberal order that we've benefited from these past few decades. And no, it's not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than any of the alternatives. And Western history is not perfect. It's full of wars and conquest and all of that. But so are other forms of history as well. The West is not the villain of history as it's been made out to be by the left-wing academics that have poisoned us against ourselves. And it's time for us to realize that and reclaim that identity, but not in a way that is extreme. And if we can do that without being extreme, we take the wind out of the sails of the real extremists. But if we can't do that, if the left refuses to acknowledge the nuance, then the only way to reclaim that will be by going to the opposite extreme. And it's not going to end well for the left. The right has more money. They've got more weapons. They're physically stronger than any of these inner city hipsters. I know who I'd be putting my money on in a fight. So I don't think that the left realizes how screwed they are if they don't try and course correct fast. And it brings me no joy in saying that, because the far right is very scary. So that's where we find ourselves, unfortunately. We need to stand up against all kinds of extremism, and we need to reclaim our traditions in a way that acknowledges the good and the aspirations within the idea of the West that are to do with trying to establish universal rights for everyone, not the more negative forms of nationalism that have emerged. And we need to return to an idea of having God and spirituality at the center of life, not in a theocratic way, not in a particular church ruling the government, but in the sense that we can't understand morality. We can't have a functioning moral universe unless we understand the deeper spiritual nature of reality, unless we're in touch with our conscience and recognize that is supreme over and above the intellect, and that whatever your concept of God is, it's basically just something which unites all of existence into a common purpose and takes everybody along for the ride. So that's what I think we need to return to. And I don't necessarily think that just building bridges is going to be enough. I think that something needs to be done about the far left. I think that they are a threat to our society, and that they're deliberately trying to destroy it from within, quite clearly. And something needs to be done about that in the most measured way possible. So those are my thoughts. Those are the things that have been on my mind as a result of the events of the last couple of days.